When you experience something or you crave something really desirable, really exciting to you, very pleasurable, what happens afterwards is your baseline level of dopamine drops. Dopamine has everything to do with how you feel right now as you're listening to this. It has everything to do with how you will feel an hour from now. It has everything to do with your level of motivation and your level of desire and your willingness to push through effort. Level of dopamine is the primary determinant of how motivated we are, how excited we are, how outward-facing we are, and how willing we are to lean into life and pursue things.
Professor Andrew Huberman talks about dopamine for motivation, focus, and satisfaction. He goes over the nuances of what we do and how we conceptualize, which leads to changes in the brain and body. Dopamine lies at the heart of addiction, and the practice of semen retention can have a bigger impact on your mental health and sense of well-being, far more than you could ever imagine.
This is really important. Dopamine is a currency, and it's the way that you track pleasure. It's the way that you track success. It's the way that you track whether or not you are doing well or doing poorly. And that is subjective. But if your dopamine is too low, you will not feel motivated. If your dopamine is really high, you will feel motivated. And if your dopamine is somewhere in the middle, how you feel depends on whether or not you had higher dopamine a few minutes ago or lower dopamine. This is important. Your experience of life and your level of motivation and drive depends on how much dopamine you have relative to your recent experience. This is, again, something that's just not accounted for in the simple language of dopamine hits. Okay? A simple way to envision dopamine hits is every time you do something you like, you eat a piece of chocolate, dopamine hit. You look at your Instagram, dopamine hit. You see someone you like, dopamine hit. All these things described as dopamine hits neglect the fact that if you scroll social media and you see something you really like, dopamine hit. Sure, there's an increase in dopamine. But then you get to something else and you go, not that interesting. However, had you arrived at that second thing first, you might think that it was really interesting. If you had arrived to that second Instagram post 3 days later or 4 days later, you might find it extremely interesting. Again, how much dopamine you experience from something depends on your baseline level of dopamine when you arrive there and your previous dopamine peaks. Okay? That's super important to understand, and it's completely neglected by the general language of dopamine hits. When you experience something or you crave something really desirable, really exciting to you, very pleasurable, what happens afterwards is your baseline level of dopamine drops. Okay? So these peaks in dopamine, they influence how much dopamine will generally be circulating afterward. And you might think, a big peak in dopamine. After that, I'm going to feel even better because I just had this great event. Not the case. What actually happens is that your baseline level of dopamine drops. Dopamine has everything to do with how you feel right now as you're listening to this. It has everything to do with how you will feel an hour from now. It has everything to do with your level of motivation and your level of desire and your willingness to push through effort. If ever you've interacted with somebody who just doesn't seem to have any drive, they've given up, or if you've interacted with somebody who seems to have endless drive and energy, what you are looking at there in those two circumstances is, without question, a difference in the level of dopamine circulating in their system. There will be other factors too, but the level of dopamine is the primary determinant of how motivated we are, how excited we are, how outward-facing we are, and how willing we are to lean into life and pursue things. So how does dopamine work and what does it do? Well, first of all, it is not just responsible for pleasure. It is responsible for motivation and drive, primarily at the psychological level. Also for craving. Those three things are sort of the same: motivation, drive, and craving. It also controls time perception. Dopamine can modulate time perception, and how important it is that everybody be able to access increases in dopamine at different time scales. This turns out to be important to not end up addicted to substances, but it also turns out to be very important to sustain effort and be a happy person over long periods of time. Basically, what we call this is the mesocorticolimbic pathway. This is the pathway by which dopamine influences motivation, drive, and craving. It involves structures like nucleus accumbens and the prefrontal cortex. This is the pathway that really gets disrupted in addictions, where in particular, drugs that influence the release of dopamine, like cocaine and methamphetamine, they tap into this pathway. But if you are pursuing a partner, a boyfriend or girlfriend, if you're pursuing a degree in school, if you're pursuing a finish line in a race, you are tapping into this so-called mesocorticolimbic pathway. This is the classic reward pathway in all mammals. The other pathway emerges from an area in the brain called the substantia nigra, so called because the cells in that area are dark, and the substantia nigra connects to an area of the brain called the dorsal striatum. Now, the other thing to understand about dopamine is that the way that dopamine is released in the brain and body can differ, meaning it can be very local or it can be more broad. Many drugs, and indeed many supplements that increase dopamine, will actually make it harder for you to sustain dopamine release over long periods of time and to achieve those peaks that most of us are craving when we are in pursuit of things. Why? Because if you get both volumetric release, the dumping out of dopamine everywhere, and you're getting local release, what it means is that the difference between the peak and baseline is likely to be smaller. And this is very important, how satisfying or exciting or pleasureful a given experience is doesn't just depend on the height of that peak, it depends on the height of that peak relative to the baseline. So if you increase the baseline and you increase the peak, you're not going to achieve more and more pleasure from things. Just increasing your dopamine, yes, it will make you excited for all things. It will make you feel very motivated, but it will also make that motivation very short-lived. While most experiences and most things that we do and take and eat and etc. won't create enormous highs and enormous lows in dopamine, even subtle fluctuations in dopamine really shape our perception of life and what we're capable of and how we feel. And so we want to guard those and we want to understand them. Dopamine is converted into noradrenaline, norepinephrine, it's also called, and norepinephrine is converted into adrenaline. So not only are dopamine and epinephrine, aka adrenaline, close cousins, they are actually family members. Okay, they're closely related. Inevitably, that means that you have a peak in release of epinephrine as well. What dopamine does is dopamine really colors the subjective experience of an activity to make it more pleasureful, to make it something that you want more of. Epinephrine is more about energy. Epinephrine alone can be fear, paralysis, trauma. Not physical paralysis, but mental paralysis, frozen in fear or being traumatized or scared. But the addition of dopamine to that chemical cocktail, if dopamine was released in the brain, well then that epinephrine becomes one of excitement. Okay, I'm using a broad brush here, but essentially what you need to know is that dopamine and epinephrine, aka adrenaline, are family members, and they tend to work together like a little gang to make you seek out certain things. So what sorts of activities, what sorts of things increase dopamine? Your level of dopamine has everything to do with those genetics, but also with what you've experienced in the previous days and the previous months and so on. When you do or ingest certain things, your levels of dopamine will rise above baseline transiently. And depending on what you do or ingest, it will rise either more or less, and it will be very brief or it'll last a long time. Sex. Both the pursuit of sex and the act of sex increases dopamine 2 times. So it's a doubling above baseline. Now, of course, there's going to be variation there, but that's the average increase in baseline dopamine caused by sex. Different aspects of the so-called arousal arc, the different aspects of sex, believe it or not, have a differential impact on dopamine. As a general theme or activity, sex doubles the amount of dopamine circulating in your blood. Fortunately, most people do not experience or pursue enormous increases in dopamine leading to these severe drops in baseline. Many people do, however, and that's what we call addiction. When somebody pursues a drug or an activity that leads to huge increases in dopamine, and now you understand that afterward the baseline of dopamine drops because of depletion of dopamine, the readily releasable pool, the dopamine is literally not around to be released, and so people feel pretty lousy. And many people make the mistake of then going and pursuing the dopamine evoking, the dopamine releasing activity or substance again, thinking mistakenly that it's going to bring up their baseline, it's going to give them that peak again. Not only does it not give them a peak, their baseline gets lower and lower because they're depleting dopamine more and more and more. And we've seen this over and over again when people get addicted to something. then they're not achieving much pleasure at all. The key thing is to understand this relationship between the peaks and the baseline and to understand how they influence one another. Because once you do that, you can start to make really good choices in the short run and in the long run to maintain your level of dopamine baseline, maybe even raise that level of dopamine baseline and still get those peaks and still achieve those feelings of elevated motivation, elevated desire and craving. Because again, those peaks and having a sufficiently healthy high level of dopamine baseline are what drove the evolution of our species, and they're really what drive the evolution of anyone's life progression too. So they're a good thing. Dopamine is a good thing. What should I do if I experience a drop in my baseline level of dopamine because of engagement with some activity or some substance that led to big peaks? Just to put some color and example on this, a few episodes ago I talked about a friend who I've known a long time. It's actually the child of a friend who has basically become addicted to video games. He decided, actually after seeing that episode with Anna, to do a 30-day complete fast from phone, from video games, and from social media of all kinds. He's now at day 29. He's really accomplished this. Not incidentally, his levels of concentration, his overall mood are up. He's doing far, far better. What he did is hard. In particular, the first 14 days is really hard. But the way that you replenish the releasable pool of dopamine is to not engage in these dopaminergic seeking behaviors. Because remember, typically people arrive at a place where they want to stop engaging in these behaviors or ingesting substances when that dopamine is depleted, when they're not getting the same lift. In his case, he was feeling depressed. He thought he had ADHD. They were starting to treat it as ADHD. And certainly there are people out there who have ADHD, but what he found was that his levels of concentration are back. He does not need to be treated for ADHD. And actually the psychiatrist wondered if he did prior to this video game social media fast. He's feeling good. He's exercising again. I'm not making this up. This is really a very specific but very relevant example of how the dopamine system can replenish itself. Of course, if there's a clinical need for ADHD treatment, by all means pursue that. But I think a lot of ADHD does go misdiagnosed because of this depletion in dopamine that occurs because of overindulgence in other activities and the drop in baseline. So for anyone that's experienced a real drop in baseline who has addictive tendencies, whether or not they're behaviors or substances, that is always going to be the path forward, is going to be either cold turkey or through some sort of tapering to limit interactions with what would otherwise be the dopamine evoking behavior or substance. So if I were to just put a really simple message around dopamine, it would be there's a molecule in your brain and body that when released tends to make you look outside yourself, pursue things outside yourself, and to crave things outside yourself. The pleasure that arrives from achieving things also involves dopamine, but is mainly the consequence of other molecules. But if ever you felt lethargic and just lazy and you had no motivation or drive, that's a low dopamine state. If ever you felt really excited, motivated, even if you were a little scared to do something, maybe you did your first skydive, or you're about to do your first skydive, or you're about to do some public speaking and you really don't want to screw it up, you are in a high dopamine state. Dopamine is a universal currency in all mammals, but especially in humans, for moving us toward goals, and how much dopamine is in our system at any one time compared to how much dopamine was in our system a few minutes ago, and how much we remember enjoying a particular experience of the past. That dictates your so-called quality of life and your desire to pursue things.